Moriah. And on the lower part of Moriah is where the original city of David was built. And that's the winding streets, the dusty streets, the buff-colored houses all packed in there so tight together. And then, as we ended last week, we looked at the second mount, which is where the upper city was built. And what's the name of that mountain? Zion, thank you. Yes, Zion. And finally, the third mount is the Mount of Olives. That's where the olive groves are. That's where, if you were a farmer, you probably worked in the olive groves. And there was a garden built in that olive grove. And it's, what, Jan? Gethsemane. And Gethsemane would be literally in Aramaic the name for the Garden of the Olive Press. All right. As we begin this morning then, we're going to take a look at the rest of the upper mountain and the upper city, which was Zion. The upper city, remember, is not a maze of dusty streets and buff-colored houses and dust and noise and garbage. It's broad avenues, paved streets, if you will, palaces, fountains. What happened to my water carriers that we had here last week? Remember, how do you make a fountain work when you're above the level of the water? You got to carry the water, and you put it in a tower, if you will, and you let it flow down and come up in the garden. Yes, rich beyond all imagination. Houses built with marble slabs. Can you imagine a marble slab? What would it take to tool that, let alone to carry it up the mountain to put it together into a house? And the upper crust, if you will, were waited on every minute of every day. They just deserved it, I guess. It's like L'Oreal. I deserve it. No, okay. Janine got it, nobody else. I don't even want to walk down through the dusty streets to get to the temple. So what did they take? Remember? How did you get from the peak of that mountain to the peak of that mountain? If you don't want to... Yeah. Not an aqueduct, but a viaduct. So when you see the word viaduct, you can think to yourself, rich and famous, traveling to the temple. They surely don't want to walk down here and get their feet all dusty or have to rub shoulders with the common folks. We'll just take our chariot across. In fact, since we're going to take our little chariots and our entourage of people with us, we surely don't want to have to wait. So let's build two of them that go across. Down on one and back on the other. And they did. Talk about expense, if you will. All right. One of the first places that we looked at on Mount Zion that was built on top of Mount Zion was somebody had a palace up there. Who had a palace up there? Herod had a palace. Herod had a palace, and right in front of Herod's palace is where we found Agora, and that was the upper market, if you will. The gold, the silver, the fine silk, the perfume, all the things of opulence. We surely don't want to go down to the lower market where it's dusty and dirty and noisy. We'll just stay up in here in our own little market. That's pretty exclusive to us. How much does it cost? They don't put price tags on it. They just put it on your tab. Somebody else has their palace up there. Who else might have a palace up there on that expensive upper city? How about this guy? The high priest. The high priest is also going to have a palace up there. because he gets his position not because of birthright. He gets his position because the Roman government says, yeah, if you keep all the people in line, get them to pay your taxes, you can be the high priest this year. Literally. Took it right out of the authority of the Jewish people and had a direct contact, if you will, to the people. So, you want to be high priest this year? You better be on good behavior with the Romans, which probably won't make you very popular with the common folk. All right. We said last week when Jesus was going to Jerusalem to the Passover feast, he's on his way there, but he stops and he lives in a little village instead of going directly into Jerusalem. Because remember what the population of Jerusalem was? Normal time during Jesus' day? 40 to 50,000 people all crowded into that 35 acres inside the wall, if you will. There's just not room for everybody. Because during the feasts and the festivals, there'll be 100,000 people in Jerusalem. Talk about packed in there. And I'm going to remind you of there are some people from time to time that were kind of zealous about their picture of the world. In fact, there was a whole group, a whole sect called Zealots. And if you gathered together with this kind of number of people, sooner or later somebody would get up on a soapbox and they'd start talking about revolt or insurrection, if you will. And let's throw the Roman government out of here. So, that's why during the festivals you always found Pilate and the soldiers very close to the temple, which was the center of the Jewish practice. Let's talk about that temple for a minute. Remember last week when Jesus walked from Bethany and he went around the Mount of Olives in order to get to Jerusalem? What's the first thing he saw when he rounded the corner of the Mount of Olives? What would be the first thing he would see as he looked into the city of Jerusalem? The temple. The Temple Mount, Michael said earlier. The temple in all its splendor and glory, and they said it had so much gold on the sanctuary that you couldn't look at it directly in bright sunlight. You just couldn't. It just was blinding. So let's spend a couple of minutes and let's look at the temple. Whose temple, by the way, is this? Herod's temple. Remember about 20 BC? When he came back to power, Herod said, you know what, we're going to make this city opulent so I have more influence with Rome. But in order to appease the people, he decided, let's make the temple like it used to be under Solomon. Remember when they returned from captivity, they didn't have a lot of money, they didn't have a lot of resources, but they rebuilt the temple, and it wasn't all that great. Herod turned it into one of the finest religious structures in the whole known world. It was that opulent. Last week we handed out some simple little drawings. Did anybody bring that back with you? Oh, I see one or two. Greg, yep, you want to pass these out for me, please? See, probably don't have enough for everybody, but pass them out what we have. What the temple actually looked like, and if you look at this simple diagram, is concentric structures. They're kind of oblong in shape. But the first part of it, the central sanctuary, is actually approached through a series of outer courts. In other words, the sanctuary is right in the middle, but to get to it, you've got to enter through a series of outer courts. Now, I don't want you to picture one great big building and call it the temple. I want you to imagine that the courtyard around the temple and the courtyard around the temple was all considered part of the temple. So to get it big enough, since we kind of built on the top of this mountain, where are we going to put all the people? Well, the temple can't stretch over so what if we cut the top off the mountain and we built the sides up and we filled this all in? Our temple square can be a whole lot bigger. And in fact, it was. That's where you're going to find the temple. And it begins, if you look on that drawing there, around the temple, the first court that we come to, the first courtyard is called the Court of the Gentiles. A Gentile could enter the outer courts. That's the least restrictive area that surrounds the temple. We're going to have somewhere around 3.5 acres of temple court. That's pretty good size, right, Jan? And it's going to be paved with tooled marble, pinks and whites and all the different colors of marble, if you can imagine, and perfectly and intricately all woven together to make the top or the court of the Gentiles. And it's going to be surrounded by a palisades and entered in through by gates, huge gates, big gates. At the center of that enclosed compound will be successfully the rest of the temple. So I want you to imagine that you're a Gentile and you're standing in the court of Gentiles, and here is the gate leading into the next layer, if you will, of the temple. It's posted. It doesn't say no trespassing, no hunting, no fishing, no trespassing. It says something very specifically. Let me read you the exact language. No foreigner is allowed within the balustrades and embankment about the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will be personally responsible for ensuring his death. Yep. Yes, Jan. Mm-hmm. But it won't be in the court of the Gentiles. You'll see that in a minute, though. But good question. Yes. It's so important, that little warning that they posted there. They are going to write it in 2 languages. They're going to write it in Latin, and they're going to write it in Aramaic. So I don't care which language you choose to use, don't be going on beyond that point. Now, a Jew could legally go beyond that point. You don't have to write it in Hebrew. They're allowed to go in. But a Gentile is not. And it was under penalty of death. There are literally guards or policemen, if you will, that patrol the temple area. That's part of their duties, to keep non-Jews out of that next court. Very warm and inviting, don't you think? All right, the next inward court from there is called the Court of Women. Women may enter that next area. Remember, this is Jewish culture and this is Jewish law, not necessarily what you and I might think of today under our standard, but this is Jewish law and Jewish standard of the time. Women could enter the court of women's. It is surrounded by ornate columns, and it's accessed by a gate on the western side and a curved flight of steps, 15 steps between the court of the Gentiles and the court of women. So it's elevated up. You're going up. You're literally coming into the center and you're rising up as well. Now, the women weren't allowed to go beyond that point, but there was a small area that they could go, like a balcony, and look over the wall, if you will, and they could see part of the proceedings that were going on in that next layer. The court of women. How much was that court? I don't know, and no one knows exactly, Diane, because it was totally destroyed. The drawing that you have in your hands is the scientists and the archaeologists and the authors' best guess at what it looked like and how big it was. No one knows for sure. Why doesn't anyone know for sure? What do Romans do? Totally destroy it. There will be no stone left upon. And who said that? Jesus. And what happened in about 70 AD? It was totally destroyed. Which, by the way, do you know what happens if you heat limestone? What happens to it? It crumbles. It fractures and breaks and crumbles. And if the underlying stone with the marble and the gold on it crumbles, what happens to all the rest of it? It just goes away. Right. All right, the next court in is the court of Israel. A little more exclusive. The Gentiles had to stop at the first gate, the women have to stop at the next gate, and then into that next court, the court of Israel. It's a long, narrow court that's going to surround the court of the priests. There's only a low balustrade that separates that from the court of the high priest. Only men were allowed into the court of Israel. So it's concentric and it's a little more exclusive each layer that you win. This area here, the court of Israel, is where the men would have brought the sacrificial lamb. They would have paid the tax. Jan, this is where Jesus probably found the money tables that he overturned. Remember, because he also made a whip of a thong to drive the cattle out. This is where he probably would have done it. Okay. Inside of that is the court of the priest. The court of the priests. This area was only accessible by priests and Levites that served in the temple. If you weren't a priest, you weren't a Levite, you don't go into the court of the priests. Men, you can stay in the court of Israel and you can watch over that low balustrade, but you yourself cannot enter into there. In the center of the court of priests, there's going to be a long and inclined ramp, if you will, that's going to go up to the horned altar of sacrifice. So in this area is where the altar of sacrifice is going to be. That's where they're going to burn the fat of the animal. That's where they're going to do the sprinkling of the blood for the sacrifices for the day and for the nation and for the occasion. Okay? At the west end of the sanctuary, at west end of the court of the priest is where we're going to find the sanctuary. Now notice this is not called a court because the sanctuary is enclosed. It's now a building, if you will. That structure itself, the best guess is it's going to be somewhere about around 165 feet tall. That's a pretty good sized building. That's bigger than your biggest barn, Jan. That's taller than your biggest barn. It's more like a silo and a half. It's a tall, narrow structure. Inside of that structure, you're going to find it's perfectly tooled marble and stone. And I mean, when I say perfectly, perfectly is the only way to describe it. Under Jewish law, you and I can't help build it, Jan, because we're not priests. Only a priest would be allowed to assemble that structure, to put that structure together. And by the way, you and I wouldn't be allowed to tool the marble because we're not priests. We could bring the raw material to Jerusalem, but the priests themselves would have to tool the marble and build the sanctuary. That's Jewish law. You won't find it in the Bible, but it came from the Old Testament, in which the tabernacle and who actually worked on the tabernacle. Okay? The upper part of that structure, this is where you find the gold. One of the reasons that gold is so highly sought of is it doesn't rust. It has a brilliant luster to it, and it can be worked and fashioned. In fact, you can pound gold down thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner, and you can make very, very thin plates of gold. So if you can imagine a structure 165 feet high, covered with pure gold, we're not talking inches thick, we might only be talking hundredths of an inch thick, but perfectly tooled. And on top of that structure will be a series of horns. And on the very front of that structure will be tooled into and overlaid in gold, but it will be a vine. What's the significance of the vine in Jewish culture? What did it symbolize? It symbolized the nature or the nation of Israel. You are of the vine. From the root of Jesse, remember when we talked about that, comes the vine, and the vine represents Israel. And it's continuing, and year after year you add leaves onto the end of that vine and it grows. The vine then would have been intricately carved into those upper layers of stone and then overlaid with pure gold. Inside our temple, we're going to panel the walls. I'm running out of space here, aren't I? All right. We're going to panel the walls with wood. If you remember when we looked out across the land of Palestine, the land flowing of milk and honey, it's not all swampland and big, beautiful trees and grass like northern Michigan. You just don't find a lot of trees. But who had trees? Remember the expression, the cedars of Lebanon? Solomon gets the king of Lebanon to give him trees from the cedars of Lebanon. At that time, before Lebanon had been completely denuded of trees, imagine beautiful, tall, majestic cedar trees. And from that, we are going to cut cedar planks, and we're going to line the inside of the sanctuary, if you will, with cedar from Lebanon. Should have made my drawing bigger. Okay. Next, inside of that is the holy place. Inside the sanctuary is the the holy place, if you will. The holy place is a large hall paneled again in cedar, and it contained the altar for incense. It contained the table for the showbread, and it contained the golden lampstick with the 7 lamps that would have been burning continuously, burning only pure olive oil. It would have been the duty of the priests to keep that lamp or those lamps burning. It would have been the duty of the priests to keep the whole place clean and pure. It would have been the duty of the priest to perform the daily sacrifices. And then finally, separating the holy place from the last one is the Holy of Holies. Separating the Holy of Holies from the holy place would be a tall, vertical veil, a curtain, if you will. The curtain would have been as tall as the ceiling to the floor, and it was all made out of spun gold woven together. Can you imagine trying to make that, let alone hang it? It's amazing when you think about it. That's the veil of the temple. Remember that, because we're going to hear that again. That's the veil that separates the Holy of Holies from the holy place. Inside the Holy of Holies, we are going to find absolutely nothing. He used to have the Ark of the Covenant. It has been lost or destroyed, or according to Indiana Jones, it's in a big warehouse somewhere, but it's gone. It is completely empty. The
Was this all built kind of in the same pattern of what Solomon was told to build the temple?
Yes, somewhat. The architectural blueprints over the years have probably been lost someplace, but the verbal description and the law that established all of this, yes.
Herod really wasn't qualified to be doing all this.
No, he wasn't. But remember, Herod's only a puppet anyway. He's the guy fronting the bills, the money, if you will. And you can imagine what would this have cost?
Tremendous.
Well, if you thought the Romans weren't very well liked because they taxed you on everything, guess where Herod got his money to build the temple? He opposed his own taxes on his own people. If he's running out, he'll just raise your taxes a little bit. That's where the money came from, literally. Okay. The absence of anything inside the Holy of Holies by Jewish law and by the custom of the time, it was said to symbolize the intangible and invisible presence of God. So it's completely empty. Once a year, the high priest, and only the high priest, would enter into the Holy of Holies and sprinkle the blood for the sins of the nation of Israel. And then he would leave. The rest of the time, it is just completely empty, because that, in their thinking, is where God resides. And all the rest of us live outside of that. And we need that high priest to go in and make that sacrifice for us, and then come back out of the presence of God. I don't know if that starts helping you think of the temple? But we're not done with the temple just yet. Herod had 10,000 people employed to build the temple. Now remember, you already had the temple there, Hezekiah's temple, if you will, or what little bit of it there was. But Herod is going to far outdo that. So he's going to hire 10,000 laborers to work on the temple. How are you going to get the cedar from Lebanon? Where are you going to get the marble from? Where are you going to get the gold from? It's all got to be brought up the hill to Jerusalem. It's all got to be prepared up the hill for Jerusalem. And under Jewish law, only a priest could actually tool the materials into the shape and the form to be built or assembled in the temple, and only a priest could help assemble it. So where are those guys going to come from? So Herod reached out into the Levites and the priests and said, 1,000 of you, and you select which ones, but 1,000 of you, we're going to send over here to trade school, and we're going to have the craftsmen teach you how to shape and mold and work with stone and cedar and spun gold and all the things that we're going to find inside the temple. They began rebuilding the temple in 20 AD. The sanctuary, before Christ was born, that's right. The sanctuary was completed in 18 months. But don't forget, we got 1,000 people, or 10,000 people literally bringing and finding the materials and getting them here. And we've got 1,000 people actually tooling them and assembling them. And it's going to be done in about 18 months. So when Jesus is born and the first time he goes to the temple is already completed. The sanctuary part of it. The outer courts were successively built and built and built and built. And finally, the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, it was not completed until 64 AD. Oh, this is BC. Now I know why everybody's looking at me. There we go. We don't complete the outer temple until 64 AD. And when is it all destroyed? In about 70 AD. Right. By cutting off those edges and building up those walls and making that courtyard successfully larger and larger and larger up that mountain. It's not done until about 64 AD. So it literally took decades to move all that earth and all of that stone. That was the bell signaling on the end of today. But I want you to think about the temple and the courts of the temple. And when we look at Jesus' last days on the earth, and when Jesus enters into the temple, where would he have been going in, and what would he have seen, and what would be the scene, if you would, there during the Passover, when the population of Jerusalem more than doubled, and all of those people had converged upon the city. There's one more piece to this. Nope, I'm not going to rush it. We'll do that next week. Let's have a prayer, if we could, please. Heavenly Father, thank you for sharing with us the knowledge of what the earth looked like, what Jerusalem looked like, and what the temple looked like at the time that Christ walked the earth. For Lord, each and everything that we know about Christ that you've recorded for us was in the context of that world and that nation. And the temple that he entered. Father, help us to understand more purely or more completely the context in which Jesus lived and walked, that we might more completely understand the words that he used to preach his gospel, to preach the word of the kingdom. Father, we thank you for Christ, and we thank you for your love and for your mercy and for your grace. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everyone.